Hi friends, host Eric here, host of Talking with Famous People. And today I want to answer the question of one Shub 'em Sing. Scrub 'em, scrub 'em, shub 'em, make 'em sing. That's what they call him. His friends call him Scrub 'em, shub 'em. Anyway, he says, "Hello Eric, if someone asked me to prove this whole MBTI cognitive function theory, then what should I do? I don't really have a proof or anything. What points should I mention which support the existence of only these 8 cognitive functions and the only 16 ways they can be arranged? Can we really say, for example, an NETI-TEFI-SI person cannot exist?" Well, there's a couple different questions here, and I like this comment a lot because it does ask a couple of very interesting questions. And even though I've covered this topic of proving this thing or what it means to prove something like this a number of times before, I really like the way this question coalesces some of the distinct questions implicit in the notion of proving cognitive functions. Okay, so first of all, what do we mean by when we say we're going to prove something? As I've expressed in the past, cognitive function model is a couple different things. It's a model in the sense that it is a depiction, abstractly, approximately, of a mechanical relationship between parts. So it's saying when this is up, this is down. When A is up, B is down. When B is up, A is down. It's those kind of relationships. And then in essence, it's modeling the relationship between the objects in the system. And in the system we're talking about with MBTI or Jungian cognitive functions is the cognitive function is the core unit of the model. But remember that in human beings, a cognitive function is not a unit of the self in the same fashion. So a cognitive function is a manner of expressing one's existential attention. You can't really get to approaching this question without dealing with the fact that there's an observer who's excluded from the question. And implicit to the question is the notion that functions ought to exist independently of someone's ontology, of somebody's being. But that's not the case. Cognitive functions are an expression of being. And so it's, in this sense, a taxonomy, not a model. It's both, but some narrow portions of things are modeled by cognitive functions. And by and large, the notion of cognitive functions is one of a taxonomy. It's saying that all the ways in which people can pay attention are finite. You know, there's that attention comes in varieties, and that to existentially manifest, to be for some stretch of time one manner of attention, is to not be another, or to be another necessarily in some limited capacity, or yada yada yada. So what is that? Okay, so when asked to prove cognitive functions, some people will often say, well, can you prove cognitive functions exist? Well, they don't exist in the sense that mammals don't exist. Mammal is a category that we use to both describe distinctions that appear at least implicit to the world. So In other words, not all creatures produce milk for their young, and some do. And if you produce milk for your young, you don't also lay eggs and under the sand or something. I mean, maybe duck-billed platypuses do. But, you know, the thing is, that just goes to show you, even though that's necessarily the case, right? It's like, you can't both be an expert at swimming under the water and an expert at flying through the air as an animal. As a species, there's differentiation between skills or expressions of self appropriate to an environment. The same thing is true with human attention. So when you're talking about the taxonomy of cognitive functions, which is to say, here are the ways that people pay attention, and here are they fit into expressions of attention that create that necessarily are definitionally are distinct from, exclusive of other things, in the same way that swimming under the water is exclusive of flying through the air. It's a different medium, so you can't do both concurrently, because the medium is requires you to not be flying if you're underwater and not be swimming if you're in air. It's a definitionally it's a distinction and a relationship between those things of exclusivity that is definitionally necessary and represents the best possible approximate understanding of the way the world works that we can symbolize. Because remember, we're dealing with words here. We're dealing with objects, metaphysical objects, bits of language. We're not dealing, as we sometimes think we are, with the objects themselves in the world. This is a continual problem that people they mistake the map for the territory. Okay, but when critiquing a map, then you don't need to say, I prove this map is right. You need to say, well, it's not wrong, you know. You could draw the map a lot of different ways, potentially, but you still have to keep Los Angeles to the south of San Francisco, and you want the scale to be as close, you know, so there's lots of things like that. That's what cognitive functions are, basically, is a map of human attention. And obviously, there's mountains and there's rivers, and there are different things. Mountains and rivers, there can be rivers in mountains, but there can't be something that is both a river and a mountain at the same time. Okay, with cognitive functions then, as we look at the model aspect of it, we go, well, it's necessarily true that I can't be both paying attention to how socially graceful this person is and concurrently paying equal attention to how to make the task he's describing more efficiently executed. So if he's saying, hey everybody, okay, so this is what we're going to be doing today, and here's the task. Now let's say I'm an FE user and I'm paying attention to how he's displaying socially. I'm paying attention to the social reactions of the people around. I'm looking at everyone's facial expressions. I'm considering questions I might ask if he becomes troubled in some fashion, like, oh, he starts to stumble, he starts to fail as a social presenter. Here's why I can chime in to help, maybe, or here's why I can take over or something. They're not considering the ideas of what he's saying. They're considering the impacts on the social web. And for them, the content of what they're saying is irrelevant. It's not a locutionary act. It's an illocutionary act. It's displaying things implicit to the person and stuff that matter, and that will matter the same regardless of the parsing out of what is contained within the node of content that he's saying, or the locutionary aspects of what he's saying. So it's true that you can't both concurrently pay attention to everyone's social reaction and concurrently pay attention to the meaning of the words he's saying from a frame of reference that says, let's focus on how to render this task more efficient. Where can we save a little time? Where can we, let me make sure that I can anticipate, oh, that might be a problem down the road. We should obviate that. We should anticipate that problem, take action now to prevent it from occurring. What I'm just describing here is an FETE distinction. I'm saying you cannot concurrently use extroverted feeling as your interface function when dealing with a group of people talking and stuff, or both people communicating and people listening and stuff like that. You can't both evaluate that concurrently with FE and TE. And as a consequence, because they're two alternate forms of interfacing, you're either worrying about the efficiency, the logics of things, or you're worried about the social stuff of things, and you can't do both at the same time, and there's not really any other way to interface. So what I call the interface functions are your extroverted judging functions, FE and TE. The reason I call them interface functions is because according to my explanation of cognitive functions, according to my modeling aspect of it, the way in which the mechanics of the functions work with each other, TE and FE are the most versatile of the functions in the sense they do the most different things. They put information out there. They get information by asking questions. They receive information passively. There's a lot of interfacing going on with these functions because they do the work of our attention when dealing with stimuli coming at us from the world. So if I'm an FE user and I'm alone and all the stimulation is information about the physical systems around me, I'm likely to feel lost because it's a situation that's going to require of me, if I'm going to be attending to the experience of the moment and the actual world, then it's going to require me to be engaged with it in a TE capacity. There's no social stuff happening. On the other hand, if I'm a TE user and I'm at a cocktail party and everyone's talking social hierarchy stuff and I'm missing the subtext, I'm going to feel pretty much like I don't get what's going on. If I'm TE tool function, that is. So your tool function, which means your second slot function, as we get a little deeper into the mechanics of things, that's going to make the alternate form of whatever your tool is your blind spot. It's necessarily the case because, for example, my second slot function, TI, means that my tool is not to interface with the world. I don't interface as a tool function. My tool is to evaluate, critique, parse out on TI grounds, consistency. Consistency with what I already know, consistency with conclusions I've already drawn, consistency with standard mores, consistency with any number of different things in different frameworks. So that's my tool function. As a consequence, what I'm not doing when I'm using my basic tool of interaction with the world, what I am not doing is being aware of my own personal subjective valuings of things, because personal subjective valuings of things are exclusive of disinterested values of things. You cannot both make your decisions on, well, let's remove the individuals from this equation and see what would be fair as a general rule, that would be TI, and concurrently be, well, let's focus on what the actual subjective considerations are, the individuals only, and not worry about the general rule. You can't be somebody who decides on both those things, because it would be like saying, every time I go into the car, I'm going to open the door and climb in and get in normally. And every time I get into the car, I'm going to go through the open window, like the Dukes of Hazzard. Well, you have to make a choice there, right? Because they're mutually exclusive. You can pick one or the other, but not both. Once you're in the car, then you can get out of the car and do it again. But in no instance of that can you get in both ways. You get in one way, and you can get out and get in the other way, but you can't get in both ways for one getting in. That's with TI and FI, or TE and FE, or whatever the function is. There are four kinds of cognitive functions, according to my understanding of it. The interface functions, the extroverted judging functions. The judging functions, actually, are the introverted judging functions. The action functions are extroverted intuition and extroverted sensing. And the epistemological functions, or those that are ways of knowing, are introverted sensing and introverted intuition. Now, if somebody's going to say, prove MBTI, the first thing I would say is, okay, well, do you agree it's plausible, at least, and reasonable to note that people interface, judge, know, and act? Is that true or false? Do you want to dispute that claim? So then you point out that within that large frame of judging, acting, interfacing, and knowing, that we can know from personal experience, and we can know from inferring systemic realities from observations of the world. Now, you might say, well, that's still your personal experience. It is, but what I mean is you can trust in what you... I'm not going to touch that stove because it was hot before. Or I am going to touch that stove because I don't hear any of the telltale signs that would indicate that it's on or has been on recently. So, for example, if I know that when my oven has been recently turned off, it makes this sort of like cooling down noises, like click, clack, or whatever, and I'm also aware that my stove, when I'm within a certain distance of it, it will radiate heat. Now, I might generalize out from that about all stoves. They might not actually be true about all stoves, but the point is, then when I go into a future experience and I go ahead and touch the stove, it's because I've concluded data from the world shows me that it's not hot, and that's the way the world works. Versus, I don't care about with the way the world works. I know that I might get burned if I touch stoves, so I just don't touch stoves. That's SI versus NI. Okay, those are ways of knowing. SI is a subjective way of knowing. It says, I know because I have learned it. It has happened to me. I can generalize out from my personal experience. NI says, I know because I have inferred a logic to the world that allows me to know things. Like, I know that if I duck, I won't hit my head on that branch. So, in that instance, that's an NI kind of knowledge. You don't remember learning it ever, that you need to duck so you don't hit your head on things, if you can see that they're going to be right here. But it's something that you believe to be, that you function with as knowledge, not as a matter for evaluation. I don't sit there and go, now let's see. I need to avoid hitting my head on that thing. I've got a couple options. One, I could try to jump over the branch. Two, I could, you just know that ducking will work, and you do it. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that we know things, that we act on knowledge without consideration. I don't need to consider which hand I'm going to use to open a door. I just either grab it with my right hand or my left hand. Same thing is true with our ideation. I don't have to establish that people exist and are capable of rational parsing before I have any conversation. I don't need to meet all these necessary but insufficient burdens to begin conversation. We all operate on the assumption that our knowledge is by and large shared. Knowledge is not stuff that facts and theories and stuff like that. Knowledge is stuff like the door, reaching out for the door, but with words or language. Like, we don't need to explain that when we're trying to prove something to somebody, that we want to be convincing in a way that resists their rebuttal. We know that to be the case. We don't need to, and if I say it out loud, you might go, oh, yeah, I guess that's right. But it's knowledge in the sense that we don't have to have it ideated out for it to be influencing our ideation. It exists as a field. So one thing that, if you want to talk about proving MBTI, is you might start by getting somebody to acknowledge that fields and objects exist, that there's a distinction there to be made, that we can make that distinction in terms of cognition as well as in terms of the physical world. Another important distinction to be made and established before you really explain this to anybody, or anybody can understand it, is that there are two planes of existence, each with its own physics, that is to say, the physical realm and the metaphysical realm. The physics of the physical world are such that it is a causally driven environment. It's subject to a linear time progression. Once something happens, you can do something else to render it as though it were undone, but you can't actually undo it. In other words, you can't do things conditionally. Well, let's try this. You know, there are some exceptions. For example, chess. I can move my piece as long as I leave my fingers on it. It's conditional. It's a conditional action. I haven't actually done it. But if I take my fingers off it, now it's done. Now it's a causal action. It's been rendered time locked. It can no longer travel back and forth in time. Let's pretend I moved it here. Oh, no, I don't want to move it there. Now, that's conditionality. It lets you pretend to do stuff, but not actually, and then take it back without any consequences, without any rendering of things. It is time fluid. You move forwards, backwards. I can pause this video, rewind it, continue again. All this stuff is because these things, these ideas, the digital objects, stuff like that, are metaphysical time objects. They are time fluid, which means that they are subject to the laws of conditionality. If you get one thing wrong in a line of code, the whole thing doesn't work. One little conditionality thing wrong, it won't work. Everything's got to be perfect, but in exchange, what you get, as long as you are perfect with the within the relatively absolute definitional limitations of the objects that you define, then you can go backwards and forwards in time as you wish, because you're not actually committing to anything. It's all something that involves metaphysical objects, and therefore it is subject to the laws of conditionality. The laws of the physical world include the law of non-contradiction, which is to say two things cannot both be and not be at the same time, space, and context. But that doesn't apply to the metaphysical world, obviously. You and somebody else can both be watching this video in the same time, space, and context. That video exists for both people in the same time, space, and context in different locations. So it does violate the law of non-contradiction. Also, intellectual property, I'm not even going to get into it. It's nonsense. That's off topic. Don't do that, Eric. Don't even go into IP. That's a fucking clusterfuck of disaster. Okay. So when you're saying, okay, well, how only these 8 cognitive functions exist? If you think about it, the fact that, can we start with the totality of all human attention? Can we divide it into these 8 things? Can we divide it first into 4? Can we divide it into knowing, acting, interfacing, and judging? But what about feeling? What about my emotions? Well, that's a form of judging. It's one of the 2 judging functions. Well, what about... everything falls under something. The only thing I can think of that might potentially, you might argue, doesn't, is faith, religious faith. You might say that that's neither a feeling nor a conditionality experience, that it's not taking physical action, it's not really taking metaphysical action. In other words, you're not ideating stuff usually, and it's hard to say exactly where that fits in. But my belief is that it's a way of accessing NI, more or less. That it's, for me, my experience with faith is limited but powerful insofar as I used it to quit drinking, and I still utilize that God-based framework occasionally for purposes of clarification on single best course, often, or single right course, which is an NI concern. An introverted intuition concern is that which is the best course of action, not merely possible courses of action, which is what extroverted intuition is concerned with. So, okay, regardless, I can't come up with any other thing that can't fit easily into this knowing, judging, interfacing, and acting for framework thing. You know, when you're talking about judging, there's emotional judging, there's logical judging. Functionally, what that means is subjective valuing, objective valuing. When you're talking about interfacing, there's an objective interface which says, I'm going to understand this experience through approximations of others' feelings and the social implications of what's going on. And there's a way of interfacing that says, I'm going to focus on the particular here. That's the subjective. I'm going to know for myself what the goal is and consider how best to achieve that goal that is a unique particular goal to this situation and moment. That's not some sort of approximation, really. It's much less of an approximation to know what you want to have done at the end of a certain section of time than it is to know what the social impacts or the hierarchical impacts of something are. I'm getting a little bogged down in the details here. I need to go faster. I need to be more on point here. Okay, I will be more on point in a second. 27 minutes. Okay, so this is, I mean, it's a long topic. It's a long question to answer. It's a long answer to this question. It's a better way to put that. Here's one thing I'll say. What points should I mention which support the existence of only these 8 cognitive functions? I would say, here's what I believe completely encompasses human experience and attention. Knowing, interfacing, judging, acting. And what I mean by that is ideating or rendering into reality. In other words, coming up with a bunch of objective explanations about things like I do right now with extroverted intuition and either a tool function of introverted thinking or introverted feeling, or you render things that have already been decided into physical reality, render them causal. So decisions usually are made in the metaphysical world. Well, let's talk about it and let's decide, okay, we've decided on course A. And then at that point, it's still conditional because nothing's been done. Then the extroverted sensing is the function that renders that into reality. It says, okay, well, let's just do the thing now. I'm going to dig the hole. That's extroverted sensing. I'm going to put the thing in there. Or I'm going to write the report. I'm going to send it in. You know, it's the following through on the actual doing the thing that's already been decided, in which the metaphysical aspects of things are just there as a guide to render your ontology as physically impactful in the world or on people or whatever. So it's necessarily the case that we do have metaphysical action, the ideation process. And it's necessarily the case we do have physical action, the rendering process. And if you want to point to other kinds of action, then do so. Tell me a kind of action that's not fitting into those things. And chances are, if you can come up with one, it's going to be a put aspect of the interface function. So then you talk about the interface functions. Well, you can interface in these ways. You can put, get, and receive. You can put, get, and receive regarding approximate understandings of social impacts. In other words, approximations of other people's feelings. And understanding of individuals as placed upon this sort of hierarchy web thing of social relations. Or you interface with not considering that and considering just the subjective logics of things, which is to say, I know how the world works and I know that this is a dumb plan and we should do it this way, it's more efficient. You're not considering the fact that they're the boss and you might get in trouble or you're going to lose favor or whatever, because you can't be paying attention to both those things concurrently. You can put information with either TE or FE. Pudding with TE is a lot like SE usually. It says, okay, now I've done step one. Let me that's a tough one to distinguish between. But the pudding aspect of FE is very easy to understand. It's anytime that somebody is saying something for social impacts, or talk about the knowledge functions, talk about the fact that knowledge does come in two flavors. That some people believe that their understandings of the world are understandings of things that are implicit to the world, and that they can draw conclusions on those things, and that the whole process there is detached from them ultimately, in terms of its legitimacy as knowledge. Whereas an SI user is going to understand the legitimacy of their own knowledge as stemming from their own experience, and is less likely to generalize out big picture stuff depending on how high up the SI is. So if SI is your dominant function, you don't have a lot of opinions about the way the world works in general, but you do have a lot of opinions about the way the world works around you. And if you're an introverted intuitor, you're much more likely to be like a conspiracy theorist or something, and assume that your understandings of things apply across the board. Where those knowledge functions fall in your stack is going to have a lot to do with how you express ideationally in general. So I express ideationally in this way because I've been introverted sensor user, that is, say I have a subjective knowledge, but it's in my fourth slot, which is I'm not attending to it very, it's threaded into service of my extroverted intuition in a way that renders it necessarily of lesser concern to me. In other words, what I already know is of less concern to me than what I can ideate now, what kind of action I can take in terms of the idea evolution. And as I talk through this thing, the ideas continue to evolve and become refined because I learn to express them in slightly different ways. I learn to avoid expressing them in certain ways so that I don't open up some kinds of rebuttal chains and stuff like that. Now, that's 30 minutes on just the existence part, really, this question. Are they the only 16 ways they can be arranged? In other words, can we really say, for example, an NETEFISI person cannot exist? Okay, well, here's the deal with that. The model says, the Jungian cognitive function model says, you go extroverted, introverted because you need to have, your dominant function is your nature. My nature is ideation, metaphysical action. And then my tool function is the other consideration in my nature. My nature can't express except through some sort of default way of dealing with shit. For example, you can see this with Enneagram, with eights, nines, and ones. There's a default way of dealing with conflict, and people will go to that again and again and again. Not every single time. And the ability to metacognate and make decisions about how to react to things differently in the future, or act on things differently in the future, is one reason why the predictive aspects of the cognitive function model, that I predict you're going to behave like this because you're this type, are potentially powerful, but misses the point. It's not, if you're doing something that is intentionally intended, if you're doing analytical work that's intended to provide you predictive powers based on type labels, you're going to be able to predict some kinds of things with high degree of accuracy and some kinds of things with low degree of accuracy, and you're going to be able to do that usually. But so in other words, that description is fairly accurate. The reason being, it's an ergonomic expression of this mechanical relationship between manners of attention. An ergonomic expression of it, meaning it's the individual expression of these relational mechanics of ontological expression is it's easily explained why they would express this way if you know their all their personal details. That, oh, that makes sense that he would act that way in response to this, given his cognitive function stack, is an easy kind of argument to make. A hard kind of argument to make is, how's he going to react given his cognitive function stack without all those personal details? Or even if you have all those personal details, you've probably done the other half of the thinking about it before you do the predictive stuff. So that's kind of an important factor to think about, really, but I don't want to get too deep into that. The reason you can't have an extroverted judging function right after an extroverted action function is because well, it's because if you act first and foremost as your nature, then you seek somebody else to provide the knowledge part of it, to keep track of what you've already learned, to keep track of the ideation you've already done. You know, and any person in the olden days would have loved to have a scribe walking around behind them just taking dictation all the time, because they couldn't do what I'm doing right now, which is ideate on video and have it be a useful piece of informational time object that people can reference and that I can reference. I can't remember all this stuff that I say, obviously, because I do this as a default thing, ideate. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm keeping track of any of it. In fact, it necessarily means that I'm not doing a very good job of keeping track of it, which means that hi, baby.
Hi.
Which means that when you put in terms of slots, what you could say is, you know, your nature slot and your seeking slot. You can't have you have one manner of attention that's your nature. You have a manner of attention that you seek. You have a manner of attention that you default use when dealing with the world. You have a manner of attention that provides your overarching valuation framework. That's your third slot. So the reason you have to have an introverted judging function after an extroverted perceiving function, if you have an extroverted perceiving function as a dominant function, is because your knowledge, you're seeking the knowledge part, the corresponding knowledge part, so that's in your seeking slot. And your default tool slot is going to have to be introverted, because if you're an extroverted intuitor and you're ideating outward, then the next thing, the other half of that is what's going on inside, right? If your nature is what's going on inside, then the other half of that is how you express it. So if you start with an introverted function, you have to have an extroverted function following it up. If you start with, say, an introverted knowledge function, well, then in the seeking slot you have your extroverted action function. So the only thing that can be there is necessarily an extroverted interface function, or an extroverted judging function, or an interface function. So if we understand that these things occur, that to be of a given nature is necessarily definitionally to seek a given kind of ontological attentional support, that if you're going to be the guy who's paying all of the attention to keeping watch to make sure if any enemies are on the horizon, you can't be the guy who's paying attention to if a fire starts in town. So what that says is we're born with a kind of attentional wheelhouse. Well, we should put Bob up there to watch for the enemies on the horizon, because he's got eagle eyesight. He can see super far, and whatever. Where don't put blind Joe up there, he can't see anything. Same thing with ontological expressions. I'm born with ideation in my wheelhouse, and I express that ideation through a default tool function, or in other words, the other half of me putting out ideas is considering ideas for legitimacy before I put them out, or as I'm putting them out. What's the metric on which I consider legitimacy? It can be either objective or subjective. It can't be both at the same time. And I'm going to habitually prefer one or express one. It's not a preference. I shouldn't have used that word. I'm going to habitually express one aspect of in my own head judging, either knowing how I feel about it or knowing how it plays as a detached, disinterested thing. Obviously, you can't take action in the world without deciding in some fashion in your head what action you're going to take. Obviously, you can't say ideas out in the world without spending some time in your head considering ideas. There'll be times when I pause in these videos and I look up, I'm probably parsing out some TI concern in my head as to whether that's, like when I stopped and corrected myself with the word prefer. I don't want to use that word. Why? Well, I mean, it's about interest. It's not about disinterest. It's saying, oh, well, it's what I want. It's my subjective feelings. There's nothing wrong with subjective feelings, but it's not a good way to explain this, especially not to Shubham Singh here, who's wanting proof. For proof, what that means is, can you objectively render this in such a fashion that each person's subjective experience more or less is the same regarding its truth value or legitimacy? When asked for proof, you're assuming that other people want things legitimized on TI grounds. You'll sometimes run afoul of a legitimacy argument where somebody actually wants it on TE grounds and saying, well, I don't care about all that. You're not showing me how it's useful, so therefore it's not logical. What MBTI and cognitive functions really tell us is the ways in which people express themselves, express their natures that are limiting. We start off being enslaved by our attentional habits. Because I'm an introverted thinker as a tool function, I begin life with this bag of blind wrongness, which is I begin life thinking that subjective valuing of things is invalid, illegitimate, not fair. Well, I don't care about your feelings. It's not fair because blah, As one becomes more aware of these cognitive function ideas, the modeling, the mechanics, this kind of meta framework stuff where I'm explaining what this ideational tool is, and it's an ideational tool sort of, but it's an ontology changer. When you start to understand that attention, manners of attention, human expression is not something that's just this muddy vortex of confusion, that you can use this lexicographical tool, and that's really what it is. It's a set of definitional blades that you can use to chop up shit, and that the approximation is quite powerful. When you start using it, it becomes difficult at that point to frame any kind of metacognitive or philosophical stuff not through the cognitive function model, because to do all the other expressions of philosophical understanding fall short because they're built and validated in an objectively framed worldview, namely by people who use language as means of drawing distinctions and exclusivities and establishing contradictions and stuff like that. that any sort of philosophical or metacognitive work is done in that ecosystem, but that ecosystem excludes the reality that it only expresses from a particular observer's perspective. So we treat these things as though they were existent out without considering the observer, but they never exist without the observer. There's no ontological expression of self that's not linked to a self. So to understand cognitive functions completely then is to understand the human being as both a metaphysical and physical agent, as both an object in the world and a creator of the world concurrently, as the observer that collapses from quantum superposition, the potentialities that continue to exist conditionally in the metaphysical world. That the universe is comprised of two kinds of objects, physical objects and metaphysical objects. That we cannot understand the universe as existential except as a function of human observation, or of at least sentient observation. All of these things thread in together, and at the engine of people's misunderstanding, the engine of people's misunderstanding is a failure to draw a distinction between locutionary and illocutionary understandings of language. In other words, the words I say have precise meanings. The content I'm trying to express, those words have ideational significance as time objects. That's the locutionary concern. The responding to what the things actually say according to the definition. But remember too the illocutionary concern. All of these words that I've just said can be noted off as an adequate justification for applying one's attention to how we apply our attention, or how we express our attention. In other words, you can accept this video as substantial enough or meaty enough in its defense of an attentional taxonomy that includes mechanical relations of expressions of ontology from an observer-framed, overarching worldview that understands and is built on the distinction between subjectivism and objectivism, between physical and metaphysical. When there's an end to that. I forget where it was though. Why? Because SI is shit. I'm seeking SI because my NE is my dominant nature, and the TI makes sure that I'm keeping track of how every one of these little time objects plays against each other. Remember, this is all relatively absolute. It doesn't have to link back to the physical world, except insofar as if you can come up, if the physical world affords you avenues of attack. Oh, but here's a kind of attention that's not covered by your thing. That's where the physical world comes in, if you can come up with examples of that kind of shit. But the problem is, it's a pretty all-encompassing case. It's a case, like everything in life. It's a debate case. And it's a fucking slamming one. I mean, it's really hard to deny when you pull away from them their own detachment. In other words, remember, you currently are displaying things that are explained by the cognitive function model. The reason you're so focused on critiquing what I'm saying and explaining why I'm wrong is because you've got introverted thinking and extroverted feeling. And depending on where they are in the stack and what's going on in the conversation, you could be desperate to show that I'm wrong because you actually are offended by the TI wrongness. Maybe because you are desperate to establish hierarchical superiority or to get one up on me or something. An FE concern. Maybe because you want to impress somebody, because you want to show how smart you are, or whatever. There's lots of possible reasons why somebody might express content that's locutionarily saying one thing, but that the whole node is purposed for the following illocutionary reason, and that's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter how you parse out what's in the node, because the overarching concern of whatever it is he's saying, he's just saying it for this reason. It's because he's trying to establish that he's smarter than you. So I don't need to spend a whole lot of time parsing out what he's exactly saying, except enough to verify that, yeah, he's smart, he's not making any obvious mistakes or something, at which point I can try to shift the conversation to, okay, well, we're both smart, so let's stop plain FE shit, and let's figure out what we can apply our smartness to that'll be fun to talk about, or something like that. That's the thing. Everybody's logical objections, those arguments themselves, you can begin by critiquing them by pointing out the fact that they have illocutionary identities as well as locutionary identities, and the person offering the critique is not aware of or talking about or considering or factoring in the illocutionary concerns. To the extent that they do it explicitly, it's like FE statements like, well, you're just jealous. That's considering the illocutionary concerns. But illocution is a much broader understanding of motivations than just things like you're just jealous. So it's kind of complicated, I guess, but the point is that's why you can't be any TE, is because if I am expressing action out here ideationally, then in here I have to be coming up with ideation. I have to be vetting it before it comes out my mouth, which means I can't be interfacing. I can't be ideating and currently also concurrently just looking at this stuff over here and paying attention to this. While I can't do all that shit because that distinction is implicit in agential reality. As an agent, the capacity to take action, the capacity to have will, intentionality and stuff necessarily means that I am prioritizing X to the exclusion of Y. That's as good an explanation as in this video as I've given about this whole thing. I think it's pretty thorough too. It's a long video. I didn't intend to do a 52 minute video, but I'm going to title it Proving MBTI. And obviously there's more to the conversation than this. I could go into the details of socioeconomics, MBTI and stuff like that. I'm not going to do it in this video. But that's how I would go about. See, people want to attack cognitive functions as somehow unscientific or not supported empirically or something. They're frame locked. That's what it boils down to. They're frame locked. They are stuck in a legitimizing frame of reference that prioritizes one criterion to the exclusion of all others, and they don't understand that that exemplifies the thing they're critiquing. It renders the cognitive function model subsumes the critiques of the individuals who critique it, because those critiques themselves are defined and talked about and explained by the cognitive function taxonomy. So it's like, whatever your critique is, I can explain exactly why you're doing that critique, and whether or not it's an FE thing or an FI. If an INTJ is critiquing your idea, it's because there's something wrong with it. If an NTP is critiquing your idea, it's because they want to display something socially, probably. Or it depends on the context, obviously. If it's a serious situation where everyone actually is disinterested and we're just trying to come up with clear ideation about this, and NTPs are hugely effective at providing genuinely useful, disinterested, objective analysis. But very rarely does that happen. Almost always there's a lot of personal interest involved, and there's a lot of FE shit involved as well. So, yeah, I think that's the best thing to remember about cognitive functions in general when talking about proving them, is they subsume their critiquer's critique, and they explain the critiquer's ontology. Thanks for watching Talking with Famous People, and don't forget to eat plenty of cognitive function laden cheese.